Hello, I'm Imogen Sarah Smith. I'm a film critic and historian specializing in film noir, and I'm the author of In Lonely Places, Film Noir Beyond the City. I'm talking today about The Spiral Staircase, which is a film that falls into a number of different categories. It's a gaslight melodrama, it's a suspense thriller, it's even been called a horror film, though as such it'll seem awfully tame by today's standards. It's also a film noir with a distinctly post-war focus on Freudian psychology. And it's also a classic example of one of those seemingly modest movies from the Hollywood studio era that holds up beautifully. And for the reason you need to look no further than these credits and the number of exceptionally talented artists and craftsmen who worked on it, starting with the director, Robert Siodmak, one of the absolute masters of film noir. I'll be talking about a number of these people throughout the commentary. This tracking shot that opens the film is handsome and establishes the period setting, but is completely deceptive in terms of the dark, claustrophobic mood that will actually dominate the film. In fact, it's one of only a few scenes in the whole movie that are set outdoors, and Siodmak gets it out of the way very quickly and takes us inside for this fantastic opening sequence, one of the highlights of the film. We enter this makeshift movie theater with wonderful touches like the projectionist hand cranking the projector and the accompanist watching the film attentively as she plays. The fact that the movie's identified as The Kiss has caused some confusion. This is obviously not the 1896 Edison film The Kiss, which was only around 18 seconds long and just consists of a kiss, nor is it a 1914 film called The Kiss by William Desmond Taylor. This film is actually D.W. Griffith's 1912 The Sands of Dee, a melodrama in which the heroine is cast out and later saved from drowning. This scene works on so many different levels. The fact that the heroine, Helen, played by Dorothy McGuire, whom we've just seen, is introduced watching a silent movie is fitting because, as we'll later learn, she is mute. It's like she's in a silent movie and everyone else is in a sound movie. And her reaction to the melodrama also introduces the fact that she's someone who is emotionally sensitive but largely an observer. Quoting from the Griffith film sets up a kind of self-referentiality about the type of movie this will be, with an innocent, endangered heroine very much in the Griffith mold. And Griffith, of course, was one of the directors who pioneered the creation of suspense on screen through cutting and framing. And so brilliantly, that scene in the movie theater is intercut now with the first murder, and here we get something that's very ahead of its time, with the introduction of the killer through his eye, and this subjective shot that gives us the murderer's point of view, looking ahead to films like Psycho and Peeping Tom and Frenzy, films that force us to share the perspective of a killer of women. That shot of the eye in particular is very much like a shot of Anthony Perkins peering through the hole in the wall at Janet Leigh, who's undressing, as was the woman here. Though in keeping with the times, the murders in this film are all presented very discreetly. Incidentally, the eyes and hands in the close-up are said to be Siodmak's, which were used to prevent easy identification of the killer, since he will later appear as a character in the film. Now, after that dazzling opening, we get some exposition, with the revelation that there's been a whole series of killings, all targeting young women who have some sort of disability. The source for this film was a 1933 novel by Ethel Lena White, who's best known for writing the book that was the basis for Hitchcock's The Lady Vanishes. The original title, Some Must Watch, seems to be nicely alluded to by this opening scene, although the cinema sequence was invented for the film. David O. Selznick bought the rights to the book as a possible property for Ingrid Bergman, but he was tied up with other projects, so he wound up passing the rights to RKO to be produced by Dori Sherry, though some commentators have argued that Selznick's mark can still be seen in the final film. The screenplay is largely faithful to the basic shape of the book, the heroine trapped in a house during a storm while gradually everyone else leaves until she is alone with the killer. but it makes a number of interesting changes that make the story less generic. First of all, the setting was shifted from contemporary Wales to turn-of-the-century New England in order to play up the Gothic atmosphere and tap into the popularity of gaslight melodramas at that time. Most crucially, the heroine was made to be mute, partly to add to the suspense by having a heroine who can't scream. Though cleverly in that first scene she has with the constable played by James Bell, it's not clear that she can't speak. You might think she's just responding wordlessly because she's shocked. Here we have the introduction of another major character, Dr. Parry, played by Kent Smith. He's kind of a utility leading man, probably best known for his role as Simone Simone's husband in Cat People, his first leading role, also at RKO. He tended to be overshadowed by his female co-stars like Simone, Dorothy McGuire in this film, or Joan Crawford in The Damned Don't Cry. He typically conveys a kind of nerdy decency, as he does here, though for noir fans he's very good in a darker and more complex role in Nora Prentice, even if he is again in the shadow of Anne Sheridan there. This scene establishes that Dr. Parry is new in town and somewhat distrusted or resented by the older doctor, Dr. Harvey, possibly by some of the townspeople. This serves some plot purposes, but it's also significant that Dr. Parry is an outsider, and he and Helen are drawn to each other partly because they're both somewhat lonely outsiders who don't fit into this community. The rivalry between the doctors also introduces a motif that will run throughout the film. It's filled with pairs of people who don't like each other and are constantly trying to score off one another. There's a pair of half-brothers, an elderly invalid and her nurse, a married couple. The film historian James Harvey has written wonderfully about Siodmak and how his films, he says this apropos of Cry of the City, are filled with transactions of personal dominance, these two-person scenes where people are jockeying for power. This scene is quite sharply written. The older doctor is a remarkably blunt and unsympathetic representative of the medical profession. He's played by the wonderfully named character actor Ervil Alderson, who incidentally appeared in several D.W. Griffith films in the 1920s. Another element of this scene is that throughout the film, virtually every character other than Helen will be made to seem possibly guilty, and the fact that Dr. Parry shows up and wants to see the body for no very apparent reason is the first of several hints that he might perhaps be less than benevolent. This scene with Helen and Dr. Parry introduces one of the peculiar features of this film, which is that because of the heroine's muteness, there are a lot of one-sided conversations where another actor has to talk to Helen without any response, any verbal response, that is. Dorothy McGuire gives an almost entirely wordless performance that clearly draws on styles of silent movie acting, using somewhat heightened facial expressions to convey her reactions and to convey the character's inner conflict, which is that she wants to communicate, especially with Dr. Parry, whom she obviously has kind of a crush on, yet her inability to speak, we'll ultimately learn, is caused by a psychological block, a traumatic event, not any physical problem. She is obviously a warm person, and this warmth was always one of Dorothy McGuire's appealing characteristics, but she's somehow trapped and isolated by the inability to talk. And Dr. Parry is the one person who is very interested in her problem, to an almost creepy degree. Given that he's a doctor, it makes sense that he fixates on her case and wants to find a cure for her, but the way he continually harps on it makes it seem that perhaps, to him, she's only a case. And the casebook element of psychological trauma and the relationship between the doctor and the woman he's trying to heal is very typical of the moment in which this movie was made. The mid-40s saw a lot of movies about psychoanalysis, and movies that incorporated usually very simplified notions of Freud's ideas. Films like Hitchcock's Spellbound, The Seventh Veil, The Locket. As we'll see, Freudian overtones are even stronger in the plot about the killer. The interest in psychological trauma, of course, coincides with the end of World War II and the return of soldiers who had what we would now call PTSD. Hollywood was wary of dealing directly with that topic, so perhaps they used these films about women to deal with it more safely. In these films, there tends to be a single event in someone's early life that's a key to their psyche, so the film can almost follow a whodunit structure. And that is true here, although Helen's muteness is always a sideline to the main plot. But this film also uses, very skillfully, classical horror or thriller tropes, as in this scene with the vulnerable young woman walking through the woods, and all of a sudden the whole mood changes, the weather turns dark, the noises are sinister. The music changes from the full-throated romantic music in the previous scene to something more menacing. The music's by Roy Webb, a composer who worked mainly at RKO, and like the cinematographer Nicholas Musuraca, several of the other crew members on this film, he was known for his work with Val Lewton. He wrote the music for almost all of Lewton's RKO films, as well as many of the studio's noir films, Out of the Past and Murder My Sweet among them. So he's very adept at creating moody scores for dark films, but often giving them a lyrical expansiveness as well. Sound is used very skillfully throughout this film as a mood enhancer, the rustling in the woods, the thunderstorm that's starting and will continue through the rest of the movie. Helen, of course, can't speak or scream, and the way she picks up a stick and runs it along the fence to make a noise, the way another person would whistle or sing in an effort to calm their nerves, is a nice touch. This film shares a lot of the style and virtues of the Val Lewton films. Poetic, eerie little masterpieces that eschewed monsters or overt horror elements and instead create a mood of dread and fear that's mingled with melancholy and morbid romanticism. RKO put Lewton in charge of his own unit, tasked with churning out low-budget horror films. He famously based them on the idea that what you can't see is scarier than anything a movie could show you. And by creating an atmosphere that's sinister and evocative, an audience can be led to create their own terror. Even that false alarm with the rabbit is very reminiscent of a scene in Cat People where a woman walking through a park at night feels she's being followed, and leading up to a shock anticlimax when a bus pulls up. And the way that false alarm of the rabbit is followed by real danger of this figure lurking in the garden is very Lewton-like as well. Helen now enters the house where the remainder of the film is going to take place. It's a wonderful set of interiors designed by the art director Albert D'Agostino. It's much more elaborately detailed than the standard old dark house. There are no cobwebs or obvious signs of decay, but things like the dead butterflies in cases and taxidermied animals add to this sense that this is a kind of mausoleum, stifling and suffocating, and also conveys the family's wealth and education. There's an upstairs-downstairs aspect to the household, with Elsa Lanchester here as Mrs. Oates, the housekeeper in the kitchen. Helen, as is typical of the governess or paid companion character in Gothic novels, is someone whose place in the household is in between the servants like Mrs. Oates and the family, often a lonely and ambiguous position. Indeed, her duties are never very clearly defined. Elsa Lanchester is immediately able to create a character who's many-layered. She's warm and motherly on the surface, yet something about her makes you uneasy. She seems a bit flighty, she has a sharp, irritable side, and she's also very funny. It's all these things rolled into one. Though she's still best known, of course, for playing the Bride of Frankenstein. As a character actress, she specialized in playing eccentric, often slightly loony women, for instance in The Big Clock and Witness for the Prosecution, both with her husband Charles Laughton. Mrs. Oates is a fairly conventional role for a woman who was totally unconventional her whole life. The fact that in Bride of Frankenstein she also plays Mary Shelley was very fitting. Elsa came from a radical bohemian family, as did Mary Shelley, studied dance with Isadora Duncan as a child, was a cabaret performer, and even ran a cabaret as a very young woman. She went on performing music hall songs all her life and was known for her bawdy repertoire. And of course she had an unconventional but largely successful marriage despite Lawton's homosexuality. It was during the making of The Suspect in 1944, which starred Lawton, that Lanchester got to know Robert Siodmak, who hit it off with both of them. Early on in his Hollywood career, Siodmak was often called a new Hitchcock or the new master of suspense, although aside from The Spiral Staircase, few of his films are primarily suspense thrillers. They're much more psychological crime dramas. He was always most interested in character and relationships, and especially family conflicts. His films tend to be chamber dramas that feel intimate, interior, claustrophobic, and although The Spiral Staircase is something of an outlier in his films of this period, it does share a number of his trademark themes, like The Strange Affair of Uncle Harry and Christmas Holiday and The Dark Mirror. It's about a very neurotic, dysfunctional family, which includes a strong sibling rivalry. A number of his films include the idea of doubles, and that theme of doubles is connected to one of Siodmak's visual signatures, mirrors. This mirror here on the landing is at the heart of the house and the heart of the story. And we get this incredible scene with Helen having a private moment as she thinks, silently talking to herself in the mirror, imagining being able to speak, and then as the camera moves up the stairs, we begin to realize that she's being watched, so that ultimately we are watching this mysterious man watch her, watch herself, a multiplication of voyeuristic gazes that's almost dizzying. And again, with the camera going into his eye, the same motif that's used in the dream sequence in Vertigo, we get his subjective viewpoint and this very creepy image of her with her mouth erased. In Siodmak's work, and in noir generally, mirrors often serve to reveal characters' interiority, like windows into their minds. The whole idea of the dark mirror is a sense of people who are trapped by obsessions or delusions, trapped in their own minds, because mirrors create an illusion of depth, but they just reflect back what's in front of them. Nurse Barker is played by another great character actress, Sarah Allgood, a veteran of Dublin's legendary Abbey Theatre, who has a wonderful, unmistakable voice. She was most celebrated for her role in Sean O'Casey's Juno and the Paycock, which she played on stage and in her first sound film, directed by none other than Alfred Hitchcock, who seems to keep cropping up in connection with this film, I realize as I'm talking. She had already appeared in Siodmak's The Strange Affair of Uncle Harry as the housekeeper. She played a lot of housekeepers, perhaps inevitably given her looks and her accent. Like other British or Irish actors in Hollywood, she tended to be cast in period films, and she appeared in a number of the gaslight melodramas of this era: Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Lodger, Ivy, the Orson Welles and Joan Fontaine Jane Eyre, though perhaps her greatest role in Hollywood was as the mother in John Ford's How Green Was My Valley. Her antagonist, Mrs. Warren, is played by another great stage star, and Siodmak said that one of his favorite things about this movie was that it gave him the chance to get to know Ethel B., as he called her. And she praised him very highly and said that of all the directors she worked with in film, he was the one who came closest to giving her the feeling she had on stage. Siodmak himself had been an actor early on, which may help explain why he tended to have good relationships with his casts. Barrymore's performance as Mrs. Warren is striking for the way that she is almost completely immobile, The character is a bedridden invalid, yet she conveys so much force and strength in the sense that she alone, perhaps, knows everything that's going on. In a way, her character's immobility is like the muteness of Dorothy McGuire's character. They're both giving performances that are shaped by these certain limitations. James Agee, in his not very enthusiastic review of The Spiral Staircase, talks about Barrymore's unprincipled use of her lighthouse eyes, magnificent as they are. That's such a classic Agee line. He had a way of couching criticism in terms that were ethical more than aesthetic, but the lighthouse image is wonderful because her performance is almost exclusively in the movement of her eyes and in her voice, and that's more than enough. Ethel, of course, was the sister of John and Lionel Barrymore, part of the dynasty of Barrymores and Drews. Both of her parents were from prominent theater families, a lineage that's been carried on by John's son and now granddaughter Drew Barrymore. Ethel may be less known now than her brothers because she made fewer movies, but she was a huge star on stage, famous for her regal quality and her emotional power. Though in fact she claimed to be quite shy and always suffered from stage fright, even after she'd become famous.
Put these in order, will you?
The casting of George Brent as her stepson, Professor Warren, is very much against type, but for me he's much more convincing in this than in his typical parts. Brent was one of those actors like Melvyn Douglas, who was almost always cast not in central roles but in support of the female stars in women's pictures. During the 1930s, Warner Brothers tried to promote him as their answer to Clark Gable and constantly cast him in romantic leading man roles. He made 11 films with Bette Davis, but also a number with Barbara Stanwyck and Ruth Chatterton, even Greta Garbo. It's often been pointed out that Brent seems to have been perhaps more interesting off-screen than on. Davis said that he had an excitement that he rarely was in the mood to transfer to the screen, and I guess she would know. Apparently they had had an affair. Many of his leading ladies seem to have agreed. He had 5 wives, including brief marriages to Ruth Chatterton and Anne Sheridan. He was evidently sort of a dashing type, who was a pilot and bred racehorses, but none of this really comes across on screen. And even as you wouldn't know that he was actually Irish and had apparently been involved with the IRA in his youth, even did some acting at the Abbey Theatre where Sarah Allgood was a star. At best, he's kind of a cipher, and often not even a very likable one. But there's often an irony in women's pictures that the men seem deliberately cast so as not to outshine the female stars, but that means we're expected to buy that these fabulous women have a grand passion for someone like George Brent. In the novel on which this film was based, the character of Blanche is Professor Warren's elderly spinster sister. Obviously, a change was made to create a part for the gorgeous young Rhonda Fleming and add the element of sexual intrigue and jealousy to the plot. Like Dorothy McGuire, she was a Selznick discovery. He signed her when she was just out of high school, and he gave her the name Rhonda Fleming. She was born Marilyn Lewis. She tended to be cast for her looks, especially in color films, for her flaming red hair, and though she can be somewhat inexpressive in these early roles, that makes her effective, for instance, in Out of the Past, as the mysterious and deceitful Meta Carson, or the adulterous, scheming wives she plays in While the City Sleeps and Inferno and Cry Danger. As of 2017, she is still living, age 93. The half-brothers are also an invention of the movie. In the book, Professor Warren has a son and also a pupil named Stephen. They were sort of combined into this character. Again, I don't know if this change came from the screenwriter or from Siodmak or from the producer, but sibling rivalry is a recurring theme in Siodmak's work and had a personal resonance. He had a very intense and competitive relationship with his brother Kurt Siodmak, a screenwriter who came to Hollywood first, but was later overshadowed by Robert. They certainly did not despise one another the way these brothers do, and they respected one another's talents, but there was some tension there. And sibling conflicts appear in The Dark Mirror, where Olivia de Havilland plays twins, the sisters in The Strange Affair of Uncle Harry, the cop and the gangster who are sort of symbolically siblings in Cry of the City. And this also goes back to the motif I mentioned before about doubles and mirrors. Significantly, these relationships involve not only jealousy, but questions of guilt, an innocent person either being framed or taking on the guilt of the other person by choice. So they're filled with moral ambiguity. The last character to be introduced now is Mr. Oates, played by Rhys Williams. When you consider that George Brent was Irish, he is the fourth actor from the British Isles in this cast, and he crossed paths with several of the others, with Sarah Allgood in How Green Was My Valley, where he was apparently the only genuine Welsh actor involved and was originally hired as a technical advisor. Also with Ethel Barrymore in the stage play The Corn is Green, also set in Wales. He became a ubiquitous character actor in Hollywood who could play heavies or jolly types. The entrance, of course, makes Oates seem possibly sinister, as almost every character in the film is made to seem at some point. Indeed, in this scene, Helen is told, "Don't trust anyone," the irony being that she's told this by a person she does trust but shouldn't. Brent is effective in this role, I think, not just because of the fact that he's not an actor you expect to play a heavy, but because his blandness and smoothness are intended to be a cover for his real nature. If there's something a bit reptilian and charmless about him, it works in his favor here. As a leading man, his characters were often unpleasantly arrogant and chauvinistic, in Female, for instance, or The Purchase Price, or Stranded. So bringing these characters to the fore works well, and the idea of him as a serial killer of women is a nice inversion of his ladies' man persona. The idea of casting a light romantic lead as a killer is not uncommon. Think of Robert Montgomery in Night Must Fall, or Don Amici in Sleep, My Love, or Clifton Webb in Laura. I don't think Brent as an actor is on the level with any of those others, but like Amici, he makes good use of this quiet, suave manner that's obviously phony.
Try to get in. When it's dark, they move. I've seen them. Creeping up to the house. Go away, my dear. You're such a little girl. I want to take care of you.
This is a key speech, expressing the idea that the house itself is somehow malevolent. It's not just a matter of there being one killer on the loose. There is some kind of shared guilt in this family and this whole setting. And Ethel B. can pull off this sort of poetic dialogue so naturally. Mrs. Warren is a kind of Cassandra character who keeps prophesying disaster and trying to get Helen to leave the house because she knows that the past is going to repeat itself. But she also embodies the past and the paralysis that has overtaken this family. And Helen, too, of course, is in a sense paralyzed, unable to move beyond the moment when she saw her parents killed in a fire. In a lot of her films in this period, Barrymore plays some kind of voice from the past, not just a mother or a grandmother, but someone who speaks from an earlier time or is the keeper of secrets from the past. For instance, in a favorite of mine, Borzegui's lovely Southern Gothic noir Moonrise. She made a number of films in the 40s, Moss Rose, Portrait of Jenny, Hitchcock's The Paradine Case, Siodmak's The Great Sinner, a Dostoevsky adaptation. This was after having made almost no films since the silent era. What brought her back was None But the Lonely Heart, for which she won an Academy Award playing Cary Grant's mother, and she's quite tough and chilling in that. As you can see here, she had a strength and even a ferocity that can be downright scary. But she never loses that regal quality, There's a story about Clifford Odets watching her try on hats for her role in None But the Lonely Heart, which he had written and where she is supposed to play a Cockney charwoman. And no matter how bedraggled and pathetic these hats were, he complained, "You still look like a queen." Allegedly, in the 1890s, when she was a great stage star in London, she turned down a proposal from Winston Churchill because she didn't want to be the wife of a politician. But you feel that she could have gone toe-to-toe with him. In this scene where she collapses and the whole family is gathering around her, we can see how even her weakness is a kind of power. Ideas about strength and weakness and knowledge and control run through the story, going back to those transactions of personal dominance that I talked about earlier as a directorial signature. Siodmak, whose parents were unhappily married, had a gift for creating a really oppressive vision of family life, something that contributes a lot to the atmosphere in this film and other films like Christmas Holiday and Strange Affair and The Suspect, where Lawton's character says, "When two people are shut up together and they don't love each other, everything they do becomes hateful just because they do it." That sense of people shut up together is especially strong in this film because it's all set in this house where there's no privacy. There's the sense of family conflicts fermenting in this enclosed space. This film falls right in the middle of an amazing run of noir films that Siodmak made one after another in the 40s. No less than the czar of noir, Eddie Muller, has suggested that pound for pound, Siodmak may be the greatest or the most essential of all noir directors. Fittingly, he got his start on the legendary independent German film People on Sunday, which was a collaboration between practically every future director of film noir, Billy Wilder, Edgar G. Ulmer, Fred Zinnemann, Kurt and Robert Siodmak, as well as the great cinematographer Eugene Schifftan. They all wound up leaving Germany, mostly because of the rise of the Nazis. Siodmak, who was Jewish, left in 1933. He went to France first and then came to America when France fell. He had been quite successful in both Germany and France, but he still had to start out with B-movie assignments in Hollywood. He also had the frustration of Americans' inability to pronounce his name, which apparently means seventh son in Polish, and around the studio lot he sometimes wore a jacket emblazoned with the phonetic pronunciation Siodmak.
Blanche.
This relationship between Stephen and Blanche has really unpleasant overtones that Siodmak plays up in his inimitable fashion, even though there is a real attraction between them, and Stephen has a certain caddish charm. I love the way in this scene he sings a snatch of the Kashmiri song, Pale Hands I Loved Beside the Shalimar, which was written in 1902 but is best known for being featured in the 1921 film The Sheik with Rudolph Valentino. But the way that Stephen is constantly harassing and embarrassing Blanche, who is an employee of the family, is very distasteful, and he seems to be doing it as much to annoy his half-brother as because of any real feeling he has for her. Stephen is a bit of an obvious red herring. He's made to be very unsympathetic in order to lead the other characters and the audience to think he's the killer. The actor, Gordon Oliver, didn't have a very notable career in films, but he went on to be an executive producer on some television series, including Blake Edwards' very stylish private eye show Peter Gunn in the 60s. And he's good here, even though he has sort of those generic good looks you associate with B-movie leading men. He's able to carry the unpleasantness of this character, his smugness and coldness, which makes him effective as a suspect. This scene between the brothers spells out more about their hostility towards each other and the very Freudian basis for their warped characters. The descriptions of their father, a kind of macho Übermensch figure who worshipped strength and loved hunting, add to the sense that this movie is a kind of allegory about Nazism or fascism. Mrs. Warren talks at one point about how the only thing her husband respected was strength, and both of his sons were weaklings. And in this scene, Stephen recalls that their father said, "The strong survive, the weak die." And he says, actually, we're proof of the opposite. The meek have inherited the earth. Stephen represents decadence, and the film ultimately shows that even though he is selfish and morally corrupt, he is far less evil than his brother, who has absorbed this Nietzschean philosophy to the point that he's trying to rid the world of imperfections. The Spiral Staircase was one of Siodmak's biggest popular successes, and also a film he remembered very fondly and enjoyed making, in part because he was given the freedom to edit it as he liked, something studios often took away from directors. Siodmak was known for being a director who worked well within the studio system, not someone who clashed with producers or refused assignments, but who was pretty much willing to work with whatever he was given, and was often able to give a personal slant to projects, very much like Douglas Sirk, another refugee director who arrived at Universal right as Siodmak was leaving. This film, of course, he made on loan to RKO, in the midst of the golden period for that studio. RKO was always the smallest and poorest of the major studios, but it has a strong claim to be the best studio for film noir. I certainly believe it was. That's partly because of the people they had under contract, stars like Robert Mitchum and Robert Ryan, cinematographers like Musaraka, directors like Jacques Tourneur. But it's also just that every studio had its own style and type of film that it was associated with, and in this period, mysteries and thrillers were RKO's specialty. One of the driving forces in this period at the studio was Dori Sherry, the producer on this film, who is known for championing serious, liberal message movies and having much more of a taste for risk and dark subject matter than many Hollywood producers. He started out as a writer originally at Columbia and headed the B-picture unit at MGM in the early 40s. It's interesting to note how many of the people involved in the Spiral Staircase had come up through the Bs. They not only taught people how to make do with scarce resources and make really tight movies that don't waste any time, they also often allowed for more experimentation and more pushing of the envelope in subject matter because they were under the radar, they weren't prestigious, and less was invested in them. Sherry also worked for David O. Selznick in the early 40s, and then came to RKO, where in 1947 he became vice president for production, and was there until the studio was taken over by Howard Hughes, who eventually ran it into the ground. Though he was only at RKO for a brief time, basically in 47 and 48, it was a peak period for the studio, with films like Crossfire, They Live by Night, The Setup. After falling out with Hughes, Sherry went back to MGM and ultimately became the production chief and then president, which is remarkable because in many ways he was the complete opposite of Louis B. Mayer in his philosophy. And during his tenure, MGM released some films that went against everything Mayer believed in, movies like Bad Day at Black Rock and Anthony Mann's noirs and westerns that showed an ugly side of America, where Mayer always wanted his films to be wholesome and idealized. But in the late 40s, the money men saw Sherry as somebody who could pull MGM out of a slump, who had a better sense of what audiences then wanted. One of his greatest accomplishments throughout his career is that he gave a number of filmmakers their first chance to direct: Joseph Losey, Fred Zinnemann, Nicholas Ray, Robert Wise. That says a lot about his willingness to take risks and champion sometimes very offbeat projects like The Boy with Green Hair. But he got away with that because he was also known for being able to turn out hits and crowd pleasers. With this film, which he had inherited from Selznick, he was involved in some of the basic decisions that were made about the script, like the setting and having the heroine be mute. It's a very carefully constructed script. You might even accuse it of being too heavily plotted, since pretty much everything happens for a reason that serves the mechanics of the story. For instance, all the business with the missing ether, the brandy being gone, various people being sent out or called away or otherwise disposed of. But it's deftly managed, so it doesn't feel too heavy-handedly contrived. There's definitely a step-by-step feeling of the trap closing in.
I finish it for your own good.
Well, I wish you'd stop doing things for my own good.
With everything that's happening in this house, it's better that you keep your wits about you.
I'm never more witty than when I've had a little nip. I see better, I hear better, and I feel much better.
Oates, would you mind coming out a moment and bring your hat and coat?
There it is.
Another classical element of this script is having the servants, the lower orders, provide comic relief, but in a way that mirrors the upstairs story. It's like something you'd find in a play by Molière. So the Oates' bickering and squabbling echoes all the other bitter, combative relationships in this house, but in a lighter vein. Though there is nothing really light about the way Elsa Lanchester played that scene. The way she talks about having a little nip is so fierce. I certainly would not dream of finishing up this woman's brandy. She's very much like Lawton in being able to get away with big effects. She's not subtle, but what might seem over the top or caricatured can work because she is so in control of her effects and unafraid of pushing things as far as they'll go, often into the strange and the unsettling. And of course also because she is funny, like this almost cartoonish look of delight that she has when she's asked to accompany the professor into the wine cellar. Here we get the first sight of the spiral staircase of the title, on the first of what will be several trips to the basement. This is a perfect opportunity to talk about the cinematography by Nicholas Musuraca, who was one of the masters and pioneers of the noir look. The extreme low lighting in this scene, with the single light source and the shafts of light cutting diagonally or horizontally through the blackness, the bars and abstract patterns of shadow, the contrasts between the actors being silhouetted in darkness or having their faces strongly lit by key lights, these are all Musuraca's trademark effects. It may be hard to remember now, but this bold use of blackness and high contrast was really not done in Hollywood until people like Musuraca and John Alton started experimenting with it. They both got their start, again, in B pictures, and developed a style that was simple and stripped down, using as few lights as possible. Musuraca is less well known than Alton, partly because Alton wrote an influential book, Painting with Light. But Musuraca's cinematography is essential to the moody, poetic atmosphere in films by Jacques Tourneur, and many of the Luton cycle, and some of the early noir westerns. He was born in Italy in 1892 and got into the movie business working for Vitagraph in Brooklyn. In the early 20s, he came to Hollywood and went to work as a cameraman for the studio that would later become RKO. And after working there throughout the 30s, 40s, and into the 50s, he eventually returned after the studio had been bought by Desilu, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz's production company. So Musuraca was really around for the entire history of the studio. One of the highlights of his career, of course, was The Stranger on the Third Floor in 1940, which is often credited as the start of the film noir cycle, largely on the strength of his cinematography, which has almost every classic trope of noir lighting and framing, intensifying the movie's themes of paranoia and guilt. He makes shadows a key component of his compositions. not just chiaroscuro or high contrast, but shadows that are an expressive visual element. And he uses deep focus and unusual angles to create disorienting images that evoke nightmares. Musuraca was the director of photography on Out of the Past, The Locket, Clash by Night, The Hitchhiker, and this is the work for which he's best known. If he's remembered, it's for his contribution to noir, since he was otherwise somewhat under the radar and underappreciated among Hollywood cinematographers, never winning an Oscar, for instance, and only even being nominated once for the prestige film I Remember Mama. But he had a long career, from 1923 to 1966, and worked in every style and genre. He was a great believer in suiting the lighting to the needs of the scene as well as the nature of the setting. In this scene, for instance, there's a much subtler effect than the stylized look of that excursion to the cellar. The lighting is fairly even, but there's this gloom, the sense of shadows gathering around the corners of the room and weighing everything down. But he's not doing anything to distract from the performances. This is one of Dorothy McGuire's big scenes, where we learn the story behind how her character lost her voice. As usual, she's reacting to what another character is saying, and in this long close-up, as Dr. Perry is narrating the story of how she saw her parents die, we see her having a flashback without ourselves seeing the flashback. As I suggested before, it's not too big a stretch to compare her to a returning veteran who suffers nightmares or flashbacks. Loss of speech is sometimes a response to the trauma of helplessly witnessing the violence of combat. She beautifully expresses this sense of being unable to break through this paralysis, which the doctor thinks he can shock her out of. This role was somewhat unusual for Dorothy McGuire because she was often cast as mature women, often mothers, but here she's playing a young and vulnerable girl, very much in the tradition of a Lillian Gish or Mae Marsh character, in the kind of melodrama she was watching in the opening scene. Like them, she's able to simultaneously be innocent and gentle and embody a kind of vulnerable, acted-upon femininity, and at the same time have a certain resilience or inner fortitude that keeps her from just appearing weak. Notice how gracefully she moves throughout the film. She captures a period style that's willowy and delicate and expressive, as if she's speaking more with her body because she can't speak with her voice. McGuire's presence in the film is another legacy of David O. Selznick, who loaned her to RKO for this role. He had originally brought her to Hollywood after her stage success in the play Claudia, which she repeated on film. From the start, she was a highly respected actress, someone who was never really seen as glamorous or a sex symbol. As I said, she played a lot of mothers in A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, for instance, or A Summer Place, later a lot of Disney films. She didn't often get to play against type. She was almost always cast as someone virtuous and wholesome. But in 1947, she won the Best Supporting Actress Oscar for her role in A Gentleman's Agreement, which is a more complex and ambivalent, even unsympathetic role as a woman who comes to recognize her own unconscious prejudice. This scene with the three men arguing over Helen's condition and her future is particularly unpleasant. It's a reminder that the Gothic or gaslight melodrama uses a period setting, a 19th century setting, for more than just atmosphere. The stories often turn on the extreme imbalance between men and women, the oppressive or cruel power structures that underlie this decorative, genteel surface of the era, especially when men are discussing the treatment of women who are perceived as mentally troubled or afflicted in some way. All three men are very unlikable in this scene, and each seems like he could be the killer. At the same time, I want to point out again the fantastic interiors and set decoration, which contribute a lot to the background of all these scenes. It's very busy. which could be distracting. All the patterns on the different textiles, the wallpaper and curtains and upholstery and bedding, plus the carved wood, the banisters, all the pictures and the bric-a-brac. There are layers and layers of visual noise behind the actors, yet it's so well handled in the compositions and lighting, so it stays in the background. You just get a sense of a sort of web behind the characters, or areas of shadow that threaten to swallow them. It creates a total effect. The art historian Siegfried Gideon in 1948 articulated very well why this type of decor is so effective in stories of horror or suspense. He wrote, "The interiors of this age, with their gloomy light, their heavy curtains and carpets, their dark wood, and their horror of the void, breathe a peculiar warmth and disquiet." Then when the door opens, there's this sudden shock of the night and the rain, which intensify the feeling that the house is besieged and there's no real escape. We're very much in Helen's point of view in the shooting of this scene with Dr. Perry's departure and the kiss. It's not a true point of view shot since we're looking over her shoulder, but there's a strong sense that we are staying in the house with her and he is leaving. The staging of that kiss in the doorway with the man on his way out is almost identical to the one kiss, similarly brief and chaste, between Dana Andrews and Gene Tierney and Laura from the previous year, where again the man is telling the woman not to let anyone in, but in fact the killer is already inside the ostensibly safe space. In this next scene we go even further into Helen's mind. Look at the shadow on her face here and the darkness behind her, which give the sinister cast to this moment, even as this romantic ballroom music is starting up, albeit in a minor key. And then we get a dream sequence, or rather, a daydream sequence, which plays out like a movie, a full-on enactment of her romantic fantasy. This is daring because it allows this kind of treacly, very conventional schoolgirl reverie to play out for quite some time before it turns sour and becomes interesting. There's something, I think, deliberately a little comic and overdone about it with the masses of flowers and the slightly hectic waltz. Roy Webb's music is multi-layered here, with the dissonant chimes overlaid on the waltz, and the visual quality of the dream also gradually shifts from this cloying ballroom image to, in this next sequence, the dark shadows and gothic look of this wedding. Note that Professor Warren is the one walking her down the aisle, or rather down the stairs, which are the same stairs where the killer has threatened and will again threaten her. The image is getting progressively more stylized with the symmetrical framing of the candles. The look of this is very different from Musuraca's famous dream sequence from Stranger on the Third Floor, which has an extremely stylized vision of a trial rather than a wedding, much more hard-edged and angular and overtly grotesque. But this too is becoming progressively more expressionistic, culminating in this wonderful series of close-ups of all of the film's characters as totally unsympathetic and cold and judging. James Harvey writes in his chapter on Siodmak in Movie Love in the 50s that film noir licensed stylization in Hollywood movies, that it challenged the standard of invisible directing that was enshrined in America, the idea that if you notice the filmmaking or the technique, then it's badly done because you're supposed to be just drawn into the story without any awareness of the craft that's behind it. Noir broke that rule by using flamboyant devices like obviously non-naturalistic lighting, camera angles that call attention to themselves, and other elements of expressionism, which is the style that literally brings the interior to the surface, presses out what is inside. Actual dream sequences are just going a little further than what noir is often doing, showing us people moving through worlds that are distorted by their own fears and desires. Helen's dream is all about how closely related desires and fears are, how easily a dream, in the sense of a fantasy, something longed for, can become a nightmare. I said early on that the sequence in the movie theater gave the film a certain self-referentiality or self-awareness about being a certain type of suspenseful melodrama. In this scene, Stephen, who is at his nastiest, tells Blanche, "Don't be so melodramatic," as if he's commenting on the conventionality of this scene where the weeping woman pleads with her lover. It's been pointed out that the fact that Stephen is sitting on her bed here is an indication, evidently subtle enough to escape the Breen office, that they've slept together. But it's also typical of his attitude, his sense of entitlement and lack of respect for her. And he has an even more pointed line when he says, "Men like to see women cry, it makes them feel superior," which gets at the heart of why melodrama is looked down on, because its focus on emotion and relationships is seen as feminine. This is one of the scenes that highlights the degree to which this story is about the hostility of men towards women, their desire to control and punish them, the male belief that women should conform to their desires. It's notable that another common feature of the interiors of this house, including this room, is portraits of women, framed and immobilized images. You can see in this shot of Blanche in the doorway there are a number of portraits around her. None of these portraits is ever introduced as a significant element, but in other noir films that do center on portraits of women, like Laura, The Locket, Ulmer's Bluebeard, Scarlet Street, there are many more, up to and including Vertigo, these films are always about men's idealization of women and their violent rage when women fail to match their frozen, perfect images. Portraits, of course, also represent the ghosts of the past, the presence of the dead, and movies about the murder of beautiful young women always get into a Poe-like subtext of necrophilia. There's a nice little moment when Helen, who's packing, picks up what we assume is a portrait of her parents and holds it for a moment. Again, the presence of the dead. This scene is almost the only point in the movie in which Blanche and Helen have any interaction, though we know Helen is aware of what's going on since she earlier was eavesdropping on a conversation between the brothers about Blanche. It's also the only time we see Helen's bedroom, which is notably plainer and less glamorous than Blanche's room. And like all these rooms, it has the darkness pressing down from above, because the light from a gas jet is on the wall rather than overhead, or is on a lamp on a table, as it is here. Elsa Lanchester is sort of in her own movie by this point, reduced to playing scenes with the dog, Carlton, who seems to serve no purpose except for comic relief and as a foil for her. And now Mrs. Oates is starting to tipple, which is how she will be eliminated as a potential protector for Helen. And she does some fine silent acting here, as she is obviously saying, well, why not? So we get a second trip down the spiral staircase. Incidentally, that motif was drawn from another old dark house mystery from 1908 called The Circular Staircase by Mary Roberts Reinhardt. It's a comic moment here where Mrs. Oates, who is worried that Blanche will notice her purloined brandy bottle, looks far more frightened than Blanche, who is about to commit the classic "don't go down those dark stairs" mistake. This is a magnificent, almost entirely wordless sequence, one of those scenes where Musaraka's lighting, his way of painting with shadows, becomes almost abstract, creating gorgeous images like the helix of the stairway, the shadows thrown on the wall behind, the very well-done candlelight effect. It's also a sequence that shamelessly brings in every trope of Gothic horror: the thunderstorm, the dark cellar, the door that creaks open mysteriously, the lone woman with the candle. It's such a perfect distillation that you almost expect that nothing is going to happen, that the film is just putting you on, but that's not going to be the case. Though perhaps Blanche thinks she's not in danger, since she is definitely not suffering from any affliction. Rhonda Fleming is so beautiful in this scene. The pre-Raphaelite effect of her hair and that robe-like dressing gown are perfect. But the camera is the real star of this scene, and it's moving through the whole sequence, first just tracking along with Blanche, and now this pan across the cellar, the objects picked out by light and blowing in the wind. The camera and the theremin on the score are telling us that there is someone else down here, and then we track towards Blanche. And once again, we go into the killer's point of view. Blanche is looking at the camera as she recognizes someone. We don't know who it is, but the fact that she's not scared of him now confirms that it's someone in the family. And then for a third time going into the eye and getting the distorted fisheye view of the victim, you realize the camera here is essentially playing the part of the killer. Again, the murder is cleverly staged so that we don't see it. In many ways, this is a repeat of the first murder. Again, we only see the woman's hands. That time they were crossed over her head, making an X. Here, they're outstretched, again making an X, but with that black shadow blotting out her body and the killer. From this point on, the film becomes more and more stripped down to the basic premise of the domestic thriller, a woman in a house menaced by a dangerous man. This formula goes back in film to D.W. Griffith's The Unseen Enemy in 1912, Lois Weber's 1913 Suspense, which both have innocent women being threatened in their homes by intruders. In the mid to late 40s, there was a resurgence of films following this formula, particularly Bluebeard stories in which women are threatened by their own husbands, Hitchcock's Suspicion, Max Ophuls' Caught, The House on Telegraph Hill, Sorry Wrong Number, Sudden Fear, Fritz Lang's The Secret Beyond the Door, which has a particularly interesting architectural theme. To start with, the domestic thriller is a perennial because it injects danger into the place where we are supposed to feel most secure, home. It turns familiar everyday things into sources of terror. The home is supposed to be a refuge, so if you're not safe there, where can you be safe? But the spate of these films at this particular post-war moment might reflect the way women, at the end of the World War II, were being forced back into more limited domestic roles, subverting the idea that the home represents security, what women were supposed to marry for, can add an interesting overtone to these stories. The writer, Mel Donnelly, had a particular penchant for this type of plot. The Spiral Staircase was his first screenplay, but he went on to write The House by the River, which was directed by Fritz Lang, another period noir, largely confined to the setting that's described by the title, in that an arrogant sociopathic novelist murders the family maid and then writes a book about his own crime. He also wrote Beware My Lovely, originally a radio play that was turned into a movie in 1952, with Ida Lupino as a widow who's threatened by a psychotic handyman, played by Robert Ryan, who locks her in her own house. It's also a turn-of-the-century period film, set in a home that's filled with Edwardian bric-a-brac, and the house itself is really a character in the film. Donnelly also penned Cause for Alarm, which is set in the post-war suburbs, but similarly involves a housewife who's threatened by her psychotic husband, who tries to frame her for his murder. He even had a hand in writing Ophuls' film The Reckless Moment, one of the finest of all domestic noirs, which is not this kind of old dark house thriller, but does have a female protagonist and is set largely in her house. Donnelly's best-known stage play, which was produced on Broadway in 1950 and starred Dorothy Gish, was called The Man, and it was about, guess what, a housewife held captive by a killer. So clearly, domestic settings and women in peril were a trademark or even a fixation for Mel Donnelly. Even those of his films that don't follow this formula tend to have very tight, claustrophobic premises. In The Window, for instance, a child witnesses a murder committed by his neighbors who then try to eliminate him. And almost all of his scripts, including Jeopardy with Barbara Stanwyck, have female protagonists. It's intriguing that this male writer was so drawn to writing about women. And though the protagonists of his films do tend to be victims of violent, unstable men, the stories very much focus on the women's psychological response to their situation. Also interesting that mental illness, various types of insanity or abnormal psychology are another of his obsessions. He wrote the screenplay to Lizzie, based on Shirley Jackson's story The Bird's Nest, about a woman with multiple personalities. It's hard not to wonder what it was about this type of plot that appealed so much to Donnelly, or whether it was something he'd been successful at and so he stuck with it. Very little seems to be known about him or have been written about him, despite the number of well-regarded films he wrote. What interests me about Donnelly's scripts is the way they link interiors and interiority. They take place largely or entirely in domestic spaces and deal with psychological states that cause people to lose touch with exterior reality. The women in his films are trapped in literal spaces, rooms, houses, and trapped within the delusions of men, or sometimes within their own delusions. This is a feature of many of the period thrillers from this era. Gaslight, of course, about a wife whose husband tries to drive her to insanity. The Lodger and Hangover Square, which both revolve around men with manias or obsessions that lead them to kill women. Ladies in Retirement, in which Elsa Lanchester plays one of a pair of mentally unstable sisters. Gaslight melodramas may have flourished in the 40s, not only because it was a time of growing interest in and attraction to the aesthetics of the Victorian era, but because they appealed to the popular interest in psychology. Though the New York Times review of The Spiral Staircase said, I think unfairly, that it was a shocker plain and simple, and whatever pretensions it has to psychological drama may be considered merely as a concession to a currently popular fancy. Though this scene is one of the ones that backs up the view of the film as a shocker pure and simple. It's one of the creepiest moments when she lifts Blanche's head and clearly her neck is broken, as gruesome an image as the film gives us, and followed by a very pure moment of spine-tingling suspense. Pure almost in the sense that, as Michael Powell's Peeping Tom suggests, the most frightening thing in the world is our own fear, and in a scene like this, the movie screen is essentially acting as a mirror, the audience watching Dorothy McGuire's fear, which reflects back our own fear for her. That's why perhaps this type of suspense can be very effective even when it's basically predictable. This whole sequence, you've probably noticed, is an almost exact replica of the scene where Blanche went down into the cellar, so it seems inevitable that there would be the same wind, the same sudden appearance of a man. For all their curious overtones and quality of obsessiveness, the effectiveness of Donnelly's scripts comes partly from their simplicity, and he was never afraid of what might be called formulaic, but here feels almost ritualistic. We note that Stephen does not seem particularly upset to find that Blanche has been killed. He's only worrying about himself and whether he'll be suspected.
Come with me.
There's something almost comic in this scene when he suddenly turns and says,
You don't think I did it?
Since of course she does think he did it, and everything in the way he acts in this scene and the way he's lit is meant to make us think he did it. Helen here remembers Mrs. Oates' advice about how to steal brandy, another neat turn in the script, having that comic bit be replayed in this dramatic moment. Only she's going to use the opportunity to lock Stephen in the cellar. This is the turning point at which Helen becomes a much more active, physically active character, no longer an observer. The pace of the film changes, especially after that very slow, drawn-out scene, and for the first time goes into high gear with her racing around the house. As the pace of the film speeds up, I'm struck even more by what a good job Siodmak does at making this house, which of course is a series of sets built in the studio, feel like a real house, where we understand how the spaces are connected. We move through them in a very organic and believable way. You feel that you would know your way around if you actually went to this house. That's a quality I associate with certain directors like Max Ophuls, who are gifted with interiors and also use a mobile camera to give you the feeling of being physically present in spaces. So you experience the film as a three-dimensional space. You experience it as architecture, as Walter Benjamin wrote, rather than just as a two-dimensional image. And of course it adds to the terror of being in this place where Helen is now running around like a trapped rat. This is the point at which Helen's muteness becomes a real handicap that adds to her danger since she can't telephone for help. Even knowing her life is in danger, she can't break through this mental block. A working title for the film was The Silence of Helen McCord, and in the next scene, when the killer confronts her, he talks about the quiet and peace that death will bring her. A lot has been written about horror movies that revolve around people with disabilities, like Wait Until Dark, where Audrey Hepburn's character is blind. This film goes beyond just having a central character who has an added challenge in fighting back, since it has a serial killer who preys on women with disabilities. And this idea, especially in a movie from 1946, immediately suggests the Nazis and their campaign to wipe out people seen as unfit, a link that's made even more explicit in this next scene.
I'm glad you couldn't. You looked in this mirror once before today. I watched you. You had no mouth then, just as you have none now. Look at yourself. Look! And there's no room in the whole world for imperfection. The only person who could have prevented you from achieving the quiet that I can give you was Stephen. And you locked him up downstairs. We're quiet now, Helen. I'm glad I waited. Everyone's out of the way. Mrs. Oates is drunk. Because I purposely let her steal a bottle of brandy. And Oates is going to look for ether. Because I made sure there was no ether. And Blanche, whom I loved, didn't love me. So she had to die. She's dead, and at peace. And Stephen, you took care of him for me. Stephen is weak, as I once was. What a pity my father didn't live to see me become strong. To see me dispose of the weak and imperfects of the world whom he detested. He would have admired me for what I'm going to do.
It seems quite possible that this clear allusion to Nazism was something Siodmak contributed to the script, or that attracted him to the script. It's all the more effective because it's not overplayed or made too explicit. Siodmak never loses sight of the fact that this movie is essentially an exercise in style, in mood and suspense. From this point on, the rest of the film, the last 10 minutes or so, will have very little dialogue. It almost becomes a silent movie. Coming full circle with the opening in the movie theater, This is natural since when Helen is alone, inevitably there will be no dialogue, and it allows the visual style, the absolutely stunning lighting and compositions to shine without any distraction. Parts of this feel like a ballet of terror. Curiously, The Spiral Staircase was adapted as a radio play in 1949, with Dorothy McGuire reprising her original role. You might wonder how that could be possible, since a mute character can't really work on the radio. The answer is that we hear her interior voice. She narrates the story and tells us what her character is thinking. It's really not a good idea, I must say. First of all, on the radio you can't really tell the difference between an interior voice and an actual voice. She's talking, and so the gulf between her and other characters, the sense that she is cut off from them, is a different sort of presence, doesn't register. And instead of Dorothy McGuire's performance here, where she has to tell you what she's feeling through her movements and expressions, she just tells you what she's feeling. So it's a pretty misguided enterprise. The source novel, Some Must Watch, had in fact already been adapted as a radio drama prior to the film, starring Helen Hayes. But since in the book the heroine is not mute, that was less of a problem. Radio drama is in general well suited to this type of story, since it's all happening in one confined space, and the immobility is part of the mood of anxiety and suspense. I mentioned earlier that Mel Dinelli's Beware My Lovely started as a radio play, and so did Sorry Wrong Number, about a bedridden woman who accidentally overhears a plan to murder her. The Spiral Staircase was also remade, first as a television drama in 1961, with none other than Lillian Gish playing Mrs. Warren, then as a film in 1975 with Jacqueline Bisset and Christopher Plummer, a version that's not very highly regarded and in particular tends to be compared unfavorably with the original, is less effective and less frightening. I confess I haven't seen it, so I can't vouch for that. It's even been made again as a TV movie in 2000 and was also adapted for the stage from the movie's screenplay. Presumably it's because the story is just so archetypal that it has such staying power, though I would argue it's really more the style and artistry that make this version such a success, the perfect fusion of horror, noir, and gaslight melodrama, that without the visual qualities of this film, and especially the cinematography, it's a much more generic story, which probably explains why no other version has been as successful as this one. Now we have the final trip down the spiral staircase and the final murder attempt, so let's watch this and I'll be back with some final comments. Though I have to just point out how much I love the gorgeous geometric compositions of lighting on the stairs and that taxidermied lion's head that is lurking above Professor Warren, somehow recalling his father, the hunter, and the way that Stephen keeps yelling Helen throughout the scene and it becomes just part of the soundscape, very much like the thunder.
Murderer. You killed them. You killed them all. The servant girl in the well. The others in the town. Today, the cripple in the hotel. You killed them all. Tonight, it would have been Helen. I heard you. Stephen. Get me Stephen.
The striking final twist here is not just that Mrs. Warren comes to the rescue, which has been foreshadowed by several references to her being a good markswoman, but that it turns out she believed Stephen was the killer, and that was why she kept quiet, because he is her son. The implications of this, that she was actually willing to protect a serial killer and only decides to act when she realizes that it's really her stepson, are not really explored in these final scenes, but it makes Mrs. Warren an even more interesting, compromised character who acknowledges here that she shares the guilt for not stopping him sooner, and it reveals an even darker side to this family. What I like about this ending is that it does not suddenly lurch into a cheerful mood like, okay, now he's dead, all's well, it ends well. There's a real sense of regret and sadness for all of the waste and the suffering. There's no attempt to suggest that anyone is going to live happily ever after. Mrs. Warren is at least symbolically dying here, and you realize that with Blanche and the professor dead, Stephen is going to be left alone. And although it's not at all spelled out, there is a subtle sense that perhaps he's been changed and to some degree redeemed by these events. And Helen, of course, with that scream, has finally broken her silence, again witnessing a death, and in this final scene, she speaks for the first time.
1, 8, 9. Dr. Perry, come. It's I, Helen.
This is a strange and beautiful final shot, because although this is her breakthrough where she recovers her voice and recovers herself, the image is so dark with that creepy shadow of the ladder-back chair against the brick wall and the phone jutting out above her head, and then the camera tracks away, leaving her alone in this corner. We don't see Dr. Perry return. There's no final clinch. It's a very powerful, stark ending and not a comforting one. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed The Spiral Staircase. As Ethel Barrymore was famous for saying, "That's all there is. There isn't any more."